I'm afraid it could be paraplegia, the doctor said, pointing to the reports lying on his desk. Then the 6 MRI results lined up side by side and one below the other, which appeared to be nearly identical to each other on the black screen. The young man took the hand of his wife, who was sitting next to him, and said to the doctor, who was wearing thick-rimmed glasses, white-haired, thin, and slightly hunched, "Please explain the situation in a language that someone who has not graduated from medical school can understand, doctor." İPUCU Sahin let go of Barak Sahin's hand, and while covering her face with her hands so as not to show that she was about to cry, she said, "I know what this means. I am a nurse. Have you forgotten? The doctor says I'm paralyzed." And she couldn't hold back any longer and she started sobbing. Barak Sahin turned to the doctor with hopeful eyes and said, "This situation, thing. Is it temporary?" he asked. "I have to be frank. The upper part of the lumbar spine appears to have been damaged in the accident. What I can say is that of course we will do our best and you can't give up hope in God, but prepare yourself for the possibility that this situation will be permanent." İPUCU Sahin could not bear to listen to the rest of this conversation. She left the room in his wheelchair, which she was still a novice in using, bumping left and right. As Mehmet Demirsoy shook the hand of a tall man with a sharp eye, erect white hair, goatee combined with his 3-day-old stubble, who was a little older than he thought but looked quite vigorous and lively, he realized that he resembled someone but could not make out who it was. "I am pleased, Mr. Mehmet, please," Kemal Gursoy said, pointing to the inside of his house with his hand, which he did not shake hands with. "I'm glad too," Mehmet Demirsoy said in his tired voice. "Thank you in advance. If you want, I can hang out in the garden," said Ismail Chetin with artificial politeness. "If you don't mind, Mr. Mehmet, please join us," Kemal Gursoy said. "Of course, what's the matter?" said Mehmet Demirsoy, speaking through his mouth. Together, the 3 men went to the brightest corner of Kemal Gursoy's house and started chatting. Mehmet Demirsoy summarized what happened to him. "What do you think? Do you think my suspicions could be correct? Could it be that my son has been replaced?" Kemal Gursoy looked at the 60-year-old man who could hardly keep himself from crying and said in a nonchalant tone, "Let me tell you a short story. About a decade ago, after a long chase, the police caught the killer of a young girl who was brutally murdered when she was in her early 20s. In fact, it was clear from the beginning who killed the girl, but the fact that the child came from a wealthy family and some of her father's connections made it difficult. Anyway, in the end, the lad was now in the hands of the police. The incident was officially announced as a love murder. But then there were rumors that there were other things going on. I'm not going to go into that side of it and beat around the bush. The important part is that after the young man was caught and his crime was legally confirmed, he somehow escaped and disappeared despite all the security forces. A few months later he was recaptured, this time imprisoned to serve his sentence. So far, it may seem like an ordinary criminal case, albeit sad in one way or another, but since the disappearance process I mentioned at that time was of personal interest to me, I started to follow the developments within my means. As I predicted, the awkwardness didn't stop. The young man was stabbed to death a month after being locked up. Even though he is being held in solitary confinement with special security. At least that was the statement to the press. 4 or 5 years after the incident, one summer day when I was in Santorini for tourist purposes, I was hanging out in a cafe by the sea, and I saw the young man who had been stabbed to death in his prison cell having fun with his friends. My answer was a bit long and I'm sorry for that, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. Kemal Gursoy took a break and while taking a sip of lemon mineral water, he looked at Mehmet Demirsoy and then Ismail Chetin and measured their reactions. Everyone understood the matter clearly enough. Seeing that the 2 friends had nothing to say, Kemal Gursoy continued after taking another sip of mineral water. I would like to draw your attention to a common point between your story and what I have just described. After the killer is caught, he somehow disappears for a while and is recaptured, while your son Boris Demirsoy has a traffic accident on New Year's Eve, but days pass before the hospital authorities inform you of the situation. Coincidentally, your wife also works in the hospital where she was admitted. What does this mean to you, Mr. Mehmet? Silence. Everyone was aware of the seriousness of the situation. The silence was broken by Mehmet Demirsoy. What do you think? Is my son alive? I have no idea. The answer to your question lies entirely in who is his replacement and why you are being played such a game. Can you find out? I'm going to do my best. Thank you. Do you think Eileen Sargent is alive? No, I don't think so. But we'd better make sure of that. How? Do you still have the contact information that Dr. Semi Karakok gave you about Eileen Sargent's so-called new place of duty? Of course, said Mehmet Demirsoy and found the necessary place on his phone and handed it to Kemal Gursoy. After taking a look at the message, Kemal Gursoy called someone on his own phone. This is Dr. Semi Karakok. Hello Mr. Semi, I'm calling from Tekirdağ Hayat Hospital. I called about an issue related to Nurse Eileen Sargin, one of the former employees of your hospital. Are you available? Silence. Mr. Semi, are you there? Who are you? What do you want from me? This time, Kemal Gursoy was the one who waited quietly. Hello? Do you hear me? What the hell is this Hayat Hospital crap? Look at me if you don't tell me who you are. Kemal Gursoy hung up the phone in the doctor's face and turned to his friends and said, let's keep our eyes open to the news in the newspapers or on TV these days about young women whose bodies were found in the vicinity of Istanbul. Mehmet Demirsoy asked, what now? After thinking for a while, Kemal Gursoy said, first of all, tell me about your wife. It would be helpful for me to find out how you met her. And how much do you know her? Asterisk. The pretty girl in her 20s was starting to get bored. She looked at her watch. It had been more than an hour since Mehmet Demirsoy and Ismail Chetin had entered the house with a garden in Beykoz. Since then she has been sitting alone on the sidewalk 50 yards from the house with the garden. She was also beginning to feel uncomfortable with the gaze of the passerby. She moved her hand to her phone. She called the person. They've been inside for a long time. It's been over an hour. They're talking to a guy their age. I asked the shopkeepers here. The man's name is Kemal Gursoy. Ex-cop. He quit the job without waiting to retire. They didn't say why. He's a weird guy. Yes. Okay. That would be great. The young girl hung up. Finally, her mission for the day was over. She walked away in the direction from which she had come. 12-year-old Tolga Akaz was walking about 20 meters in front of his parents when he held the handle of the leash of their dog named Bella. 5-year-old Bella was a Labrador and an extremely calm temperament. Still, Tolga had a superior sense of duty on his face, as if he was safely walking a Doberman or Rottweiler. Mehmet and Seval Akaz, who were in their early 50s, loved nature and sports. The couple, who lived in Sarıyer, used to go for a walk in the Belgrade forest whenever they could. On that Sunday, it wasn't even 8 o'clock when the family left the house. Now it was almost noon. Bella suddenly started to get cranky. Her facial expression changed. At first, she began to make sounds that resembled the sounds of a person with a cold while gargling. Then she began to bark intermittently, focusing on a certain point. When she stopped barking, she sniffed the air. Then, suddenly she jumped up and started running fast. It was as if Tolga Akaz was going to fall. At the last moment, he pulled himself together and began to run quickly, so as not to let go of the dog's leash. The 3-meter-wide dirt road had a wooded mound on the right side, a steep slope on the left side, also densely covered with trees, and the road curved slightly to the right. The steep slope was about 10 meters deep, after which the dirt ground began to flatten again. Noticing that something was wrong, Mehmet and Seval Akaz first called out to Tolga to let go of the dog's leash. After proceeding a few meters, they started to run in panic to catch Tolga, who was out of sight on the right-leaning part of the dirt road. Unable to understand what was going on, Tolga reflexively ran with Bella for about 100 meters. He was scared and confused. He felt like he was moving in a dream. He felt like his fast-moving legs didn't belong to him. It was as if he was watching someone else's on TV. Although the young man moved to a different dimension of consciousness due to the panic he experienced, his survival instinct prevailed at the last moment and he let go of Bella's leash at the last moment, as she jumped up the steep slope at a certain point of the dirt walkway. He quickly fell to the ground and began to scream, panting. "Mommy?" He was relieved when his parents, whom he panicked even more because he couldn't see them at that moment, appeared 30 seconds later. Seval Akaz hurriedly hugged her son, who was trying to get up from the ground by shaking his head. "Are you okay, baby? You don't have anything, do you?" Tolga Akaz stood up and said solemnly, "I'm fine, Mom," as if he wasn't the one who was about to cry just now. Mehmet Akaz said, "He is a big man, he will not be anything." Then, pointing to Bella, who was digging in the ground as if in a trance at the foot of a tree about 5 feet below her, larger than those around her, he asked, "What do you think he found there?" as if he were asking the question more to himself than to his wife and son. They all looked down. Although dense trees and bushes partially obstructed the view, it seemed that their dog was doing well and had found something there. "He did that? Do what?" İpek Sahin shifted her head down imperceptibly, pointing with her eyes to her legs, which she would not be able to use for the rest of her life. Legs that she never thought she would lose while running left and right until 3 months ago. Now, as she sat in his wheelchair, looking at her numb legs hidden under a blanket like corpses buried in a grave, her old life felt like a dream that had never happened. A tear rolled down her eye. "Accident? Baby, please?" I know what a hard time you've been through, but please let me wrap it up. There are things you don't know. You remember the dinner we had in the Maiden's Tower in December, don't you? Of course. So what? That night after I got up from dinner, Barak Sahin was listening to his wife with great attention. Yes. I wrote a message to Mehmet Demirsoy. The man was confused. A message? What message? I wrote to the man that he was in danger. What kind of danger are you talking about? From Elif. As you know, Elif and I have been friends since college. We stayed in the same house for 2 years. I know that much, yes. Apparently there are things I don't know. Exactly. But before I tell you about what Elif did back then, I think I'd better tell you what happened in the last few months. I'm listening to you. Mehmet Demirsoy has a son named Baris in his 20s. On the night we went out to dinner, he talked about it. A week later, on New Year's Eve, the poor boy got into a car accident on his motorcycle. He was seriously injured. But he got through it. Sorry. But what does that have to do with Elif? Take your time. You'll understand. But first, I have something to tell you about my own accident. On that day, my Toyota brakes weren't working. Barak Sahin seemed to be at least ready to take IPEC's next story seriously. All right. Please do not leave until the authorities arrive. Thanks for informing me. The police call center operator hung up. Then he dialed another number. Hi sir, I just received a report of a murder. The caller said they found the body of a young woman while hiking with his family in the Belgrade forest. The body was spotted by their dog. Yes, they are there. I'm letting you know the exact location. An hour later, when the crime scene investigation team arrived in the Belgrade forest with a sufficient number of paramedics and police officers, Sevil and Tolga Akas were waiting on the walkway, and Mehmet Akas and Bella were waiting under a large pine tree about 15 meters down the steep slope. An hour and a half ago, no matter how hard Mehmet Akas tried, he could not persuade Bella to come upstairs, and when he realized that there was a serious situation, he went downstairs despite the risk of injury. Akas, who was resigned by the sight he saw on the small plain right at the foot of the tree, wrote a message instead of calling out to his wife who was waiting above. I'm fine. Bella's fine too, don't worry. There's a corpse here. Don't show it to Tolga, make up an excuse. I'm calling the police, don't leave until they come. An elderly man in civilian clothes, slightly bald and with a belly protruding, approached Sevil Akas with a cigarette in his mouth and asked where the body was, while the young police officer behind him scratched his nose, which was red by pollen in the forest, waiting for the man's instructions. Sevil Akas first showed the bald and pot-bellied official her identity card as per the procedure. She then summarized what had happened. The bald, pot-bellied man drew a circle with his finger and ordered the officer to form a security circle as he scratched his nose. On the man's next order, the 3 officers took the necessary security measures and landed next to Mehmet Akas. One of the 3 would collect the evidence, the other would take pictures. The last one was a paramedic. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mehmet and Sevil Akas were free after signing their statements. It took until 8 p.m. for the crime scene investigation team to complete the necessary examinations before taking the body to the forensic institution. I can say that our marriage was sudden. After losing my first wife, I was in a vacuum. One day, while I was wandering around with my vehicle to distract myself, I felt severe dizziness and stopped by the nearby Sisley Research Hospital. It's a place I'm already familiar with and have been to many times before. Elif was the nurse who took care of me at the hospital that day. I don't remember seeing her before. An affinity arose between us in a way that I could not understand how or why. She was very friendly, caring and beautiful. The next day we went out to dinner with her. Normally, I'm not someone who tells people about my private life, I'm not an attention freak at all, but somehow, on our first date, I told Elif everything I had about myself. She listened to me for hours with great attention. After a while, she started buying me gifts, cooking, and telling me that if I married her, she would make me forget all the difficulties I was going through. To follow, well, it came to sexuality. We started to be with her. In the months that followed, we were engaged to be married. Kemal Gursoy said, "You said that Ms. Elif listened to you for hours. Of course, everyone likes it. And how much did she talk about himself? Have you asked her detailed questions about her past? What was her attitude on these issues? Please tell me what you know about her past." Of course, she told me about her past, but in general, I would say that she didn't like to talk too much about herself. She was born and raised in Antalya. She is the only child of a middle-class family. At the age of 18, she moved to Istanbul to study at university. That same year, she lost his parents in a car accident. For the last 20 years, she has worked as a nurse in various hospitals, most of them in Istanbul. Has she never been married? Doesn't she have children? From what she told me, no. Do you think what they tell you about herself is true? I don't know. There are no parents, no ex-husbands and children, no siblings. The lonely, vulnerable and beautiful woman, whose life has been spent working, falls in love with the rich businessman, whose blood pressure she measures in the hospital, and dedicates her life to him. Very convincing. Kemal Gursoy did not find it necessary to pronounce out loud what was on his mind. Instead he said, I see. Okay, that hospital. You said you've been there before. Would your son Baris go there too? Yes. We went there with Baris too. Ismail told me that you suspected that a young girl had been following you for several days. Do you have any guesses as to who the girl is and why she's watching you? As a matter of fact, I think I've seen the girl somewhere before, but I can't remember who she was. The reason why she followed me must have something to do with all of this, but I don't know much more. Mr. Mehmet, I will have to call a few places and stop by 1 or 2 places and see some things in person. This will take me a few days at most. Then I will return to you and let you know. I may also need to ask you for something. During this time, I recommend that you stay away from your home for your own safety. Can you do that? I think yes. Fine. In the first weeks of our 3rd grade, Elif was very obsessed with our handsome physiology teacher, Mr. Yunal. She tried earnestly to get the man. In those years she was texting the man with her mobile phone, buying gifts endlessly, wearing her most provocative clothes and going in and out of the man's room at the university. I don't know how far it goes. But in the end it became clear that she did not get what she wanted. She threw tantrums. There is no item left in the house that she did not break. After a while, she prepared a completely fabricated report and filed a criminal complaint against Yunal Hoka. The poor man was already having a very hard time. The psychopath kidnapped the man's 4-year-old daughter and then killed her. In such a period, Mr. Yunal also had to deal with Elif. Elif claimed that the man sexually harassed her when things did not go as she wanted. And he won the case. Mr. Yunal was immediately suspended. Then he was arrested. Then he was abandoned by his wife. He faces up to 10 years in prison. All the girls in our department knew the ins and outs of the case, but for a long time no one dared to speak out. That includes me. Then a friend named Semra couldn't stand it and gave a statement to the police. After several months of investigation, the truth of the matter came out. Mr. Yunal was released. When the incident was concluded, it had been a few months since we graduated, so Elif had no problems with graduation. She was sentenced to a 2-year sentence and her sentence was suspended on the condition that she not be involved in any crime for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, she was exonerated without anything on her record. It looks pretty annoying. You've become roommates with a dangerous person. Definitely. But I'm not done yet. 1 or 2 years after graduating, Elif gave birth to a son out of wedlock. Then she hurriedly married the chief physician of the hospital where she worked at that time. I think it was 2004 or 2005. The man was about 20 years older than Elif. As you can imagine, the marriage didn't last long. They divorced about 2 years later. Elif continued on her way without paying for what she did at the university, receiving alimony from the wealthy chief physician and having a child. But she didn't stop there. About 2 or 3 years after my divorce, I received some sad news. Barak Sahin interjected. Did something happen to your friend Semra? That's exactly what happened. Like me, she was in a car accident. And like Baris, the son of Mehmet Demirsoy. Is she? No. She was lucky. She made a full recovery. But losing 2 years? Ghastly. And what happened to Elif's son? How could she hide from Mehmet Demirsoy that she had a child? Her son? It's a bit of a mess there. When Dr. Ahmet Ergin opened the door of the cool autopsy room, he felt the pungent smell of formaldehyde in his noses. He put on his gloves and put on his mask before proceeding to examine the body. Then he adjusted the height of the autopsy table, which was made of stainless steel. He took one last look at the report he had left on the portable coffee table just to the left of the autopsy table, which carried the necessary surgical instruments and chemical analyzers. Just as he was about to unzip the special bag in which the body was placed, he paused, startled by the sound of the room's cooling system reactivating. Although he had been doing this job for years, he had never fully gotten used to this ominous environment. During the examinations, his assistant, Pelin Kakir, who mostly undertook the photo shoot, did not come to work that day due to the gallbladder surgery she had undergone. Pelin was an inexperienced girl, and it was questionable how much she benefited Dr. Ergin. But she is really beautiful. That's why Ahmet Ergin felt the absence of his assistant. Here we go. Dr. Ergin started with an external examination. The woman's face was pale and dull from having been buried under the ground for 3 days. He carefully examined every area up to her fingertips. On the inside of the left arm, a few inches above the elbow, a small needle mark caught his attention. He took note of this. After taking a picture of the area, he continued where he left off. The young woman shuddered slightly before opening the garden gate. The rusty latch of the door was slightly stuck. She pulled it up. A gut-wrenching metallic rubbing sound was heard. Then she probed the door, which she wasn't sure if it had been pushed open or pulled. The door opened outward. The old gate was quite heavy and neglected, as was the garden from which it opened. It opened with rubbing and creaking. The young woman timidly stepped into the garden. When she did this, she realized that she was questioning herself. Does he deserve so much sacrifice? I hope I don't get in trouble. At that moment, with the wind blowing, she noticed the smell of iodine coming to her nose. For some reason, she attributed the smell of iodine to the fact that she was able to muster up the courage to move on, even though she knew she had nothing to do with it. Then, suddenly she flinched. She could hardly contain herself from screaming. A curious pair of eyes, peering from the makeshift hut among the tall and neglected bushes, had been watching her for some time, not knowing how long. After making sure that the German shepherd was in chains, she continued to move forward. She was finally able to cross the 50-meter road and rang the bell. As soon as she realized that the bell was not ringing, she also realized that she was not surprised by it. Wondering how a man living in such a place would be of any use to whom, she knocked on the door with her hand. She hoped no one would open it. But that's not what happened. Before she had to wait long, the door opened. Behind the door appeared a tall, thin man of about 60 years of age, with glasses, white hair, and a goatee. The man's style and sharp features reminded the young girl of someone she knew. "Here, young lady, who did you look at?" Before she could answer, she noticed that her mouth was dry and her heartbeat was quickening, and that she felt like she was in a fantasy movie. "Well, are you Kemal Gursoy?" "Yes, I'm Kemal. The reason I came here is..." "Would you like a glass of water, young lady?" said Kemal Gursoy with his right hand as he motioned for the young woman to enter the house. "Please don't bother, I think I know who you are." After completing what Elif had told her about her son, İPUCU Sahin took a sip of the water that her husband had handed her. "Do you believe me now?" Barak Sahin had to admit that his wife's account was not delusional. When you put what Elif Yilmaz has been doing since her youth, a certain profile emerged. A dangerous profile. And her son, whom she skillfully hid from her husband, also seemed to have something to do with recent events. He could not know if everything İPUCU told him was true verbatim. But it was clear that it wasn't crazy nonsense. And that something needs to be done about them. After nearly an hour and a half of conversation, the young girl's initial uneasiness was replaced by a feeling of curiosity and respect. This man, who looked like a Dutch painter whose name she couldn't remember, seemed to help things work out. When Kemal Gursoy closed the door to meet again, the quaint house by the sea did not seem to the young woman to be straight out of a horror movie. A few days later, Kemal Gursoy was the first to notice the news of his death in the newspaper. The third-page story read, "Atrocities in the Belgrade Forest." The body of a woman in her 30s, who was found by chance by a family on a morning walk in the Belgrade Forest the previous week, was referred to the Forensic Medicine Institution immediately after the crime scene examinations, and the autopsy results revealed that the young woman was poisoned to death. The identity of the unfortunate woman has not yet been established. Kemal Gursoy left the empty coffee cup on the coffee table. He looked at his watch. It was close to noon. After cursing himself nicely for agreeing to the job, he made himself another cup of coffee to clear his head. Association Professor Dr. Semih Karakok has finally completed his examination, which he has been continuing for half an hour. He sat down at his desk. After swelling and settling into his chair, he told his patient to sit in the chair on the other side of the table. As he did so, he realized that he felt conflicting things about the middle-aged, chubby, ugly but rich woman, alternating between disgust and pleasure. In his opinion, the reason for the existence of such women, who lived luxurious lives with their husband's money, was to make money for plastic surgeons. He envisioned a series of surgeries he would do and the money he would earn. His mouth watered. While explaining what was to be done to the woman, he took care to adopt a sincere and serious attitude in order to camouflage what was on his mind. "Mrs. Nilgün, as far as I am concerned, you are a nice woman and you do not need medical intervention much. But since you have come here, it is my duty to return you to your youthful maidenhood." The woman chuckled slightly and looked at Semih Karakok flirtatiously. Karakok continued, "We're going to have a touch of a couple of stages. First, we will apply liposuction to your waist area and under the chin to save you from your slight excess weight. Of course, you will maintain your weight with proper diet and sports. Then we will clarify your cheekbones and facial features with the filling. I do not recommend a facelift. You have a healthy face for your age, but if you want, we can make you look much more attractive by making a small intervention on your lips. And I think we can make your breasts grow very slightly. Nilgün Kappa, who is 160 centimeters tall, imagined that she would look like Diane Lane or Cate Blanchett while listening to Doc. A few months later she would see what she looked like, but it would be too late. As you see fit, doctor, she said with a grin. Is there anything we need to do right now? Very well, replied Semi Karakok. So let me give you detailed information about the actions to be taken. Look at the monitor, please. 20 minutes later, Dr. Karakok bid farewell to Nilgün Kappa. He looked at his watch. It was 12:15. Before taking his lunch break, he quickly glanced at the daily news on his smartphone, as is his custom. It was then that he saw the news that the lifeless body of a young woman had been found in the Belgrade forest. The woman could not be identified. But that didn't matter. He knew exactly who she was. He found the letter E from the phone's contacts. When Kemal Gürsoy failed to start his car on his fifth, or maybe sixth, attempt, he found the solution in public transport. He felt confused as he prepared to leave the house. He had spent his last years isolating himself from life. For the first time in a long time, he was going to mingle with people again for some serious business. Thoughts and conflicting emotions rushed through his mind that tried to keep him from doing what he was going to do. He didn't mind. And the fact that his 2000 model Lada Niva does not work. He didn't expect it to work anyway. He hadn't used it in the last 10 years. The car lay in a corner of the garden, surrounded by bushes. Kemal Gürsoy's vehicle, which he once loved very much, was punished and left for dead because it reminded him of his past that he wanted to get rid of. His past when his loved ones were still alive. A road of about 40 kilometers from Beykoz to Fatih Vatan Street was waiting for Kemal Gürsoy. This would mean an hour and a half if he had any luck in Istanbul conditions. Probably more. Because after getting off the metro in Aksaray, he was planning to walk to Vatan Street. That way he would have cleared his head a little more before meeting his former colleague Semil Ezen. Or maybe he would realize what a ridiculous job he had undertaken, and go back home when the road was near. First he got on the public bus. As he traveled standing on the public bus, he looked around with unwarranted optimism, wondering if one of the young people would give him a seat. Of course that didn't happen. At the next stop, the driver braked unexpectedly hard, and some of the standing passengers collided with each other. An estimated 1/3 of the passengers had the bus driver's mother ringing in their ears. Then the doors opened. Taking advantage of the large number of passengers disembarking through the back door, a group of Syrian refugees, or perhaps Afghan, Kemal Gürsoy was not sure about this part of the matter, attempted to board the bus without using a card. A small fight ensued. Thankfully, the bus was able to move again without anyone stabbing anyone. While all this was going on, Kemal Gürsoy compared himself to fictional detectives in literature. He couldn't remember Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes driving a public bus to chase the killer. Or other characters who aren't as famous as these two. I need to get my car repaired as soon as possible. He got off the bus in Üsküdar. He took a deep breath. He was going to go to the European side with Marmari, which he did not like at all, could not warm up to and had only used 2 or 3 times before. He entered the Marmari station near Üsküdar Square. He entered through the turnstiles using his Istanbul card. He took the Marmari train in the direction of Halkali. After traveling about 8 or 10 kilometers, he got off at Yenikapı station. He took the Aksaray metro from Yenikapı station, which is a major transfer center. Finally he got off the subway in Aksaray. There was a kilometer of road in front of him. He would cover this road on foot in 10 or 15 minutes. So that's how much time he had to give up. He began to walk with calm steps. As he walked, he watched the restaurants and shops lined up along the road. He realized that he hadn't done that for a long time. He liked to watch the people running around, the cafes and fast food chains with tables and chairs overflowing into the street, the windows of the stores, most of which were about clothing, although it was not his area of interest. The uneasiness he had felt when he left the house an hour and a half earlier had disappeared. When he arrived at his destination he looked at his watch. There were 20 to 12. His walk lasted 20 minutes. Kemal Gürsoy looked at the Istanbul Police Department complex, which was built on a total area of 20,000 square meters from the outside. There was a large space in the middle of the area, which was roughly square in shape from a bird's eye view, and this space essentially served as a parking lot. The main service building consisted of a large white rectangular 8-story structure supported by gray columns, and formed one side of the square space by itself. There were 3 other buildings in the complex that housed various units and had similar physical characteristics to the main service building, but were smaller than it. Before entering the area, which was surrounded by buildings like castle walls, Kemal Gürsoy considered everything remarkable about the 30 years he spent here. In 1984, when he was still in his early 20s, he worked for a year at the Istanbul Police Department, which was in Kagaloglu at that time, and was transferred to it a year later. He had spent almost 30 years of his life here until 2013, when he decided to leave office. He loved his job. By many, he was the most capable member of the crime scene investigation team. He had probably been involved firsthand in uncovering a greater number of murders than anyone else had ever could. But those days were gone. Or maybe Kemal Gürsoy returned to the real world, getting rid of the thoughts he was immersed in with the sound of the horn sounding like crazy. When he is immersed in his memories, he unwittingly get off the sidewalk and head towards the middle of the highway to get a better view of the police department building. Gathering his courage, he first walked through the main entrance gate of the complex. Then, taking quick steps through the area full of cars and people, he entered through the door with the words, Turkish Istanbul Security Directorate, written in gold letters on a dark blue background. Both entrances were searched as a routine procedure. He made his way to the section marked Consultation. He approached the uniformed young man, who was immediately clear that he had just started work. He bowed and said, I came to visit Chief Commissioner Cemal Ezen. He was waiting for me. Will you let me know I'm coming? After staring blankly at Kemal Gürsoy's face for a few seconds, the young policeman called Cemal Ezen on the phone without thinking to ask the man's name. Sir, there is a gentleman here who says he has come to visit you. He said you are waiting for him. The voice on the other side of the phone said something that Kemal Gürsoy couldn't quite hear, but he guessed. Thereupon, the young man turned to Kemal Gürsoy and said indifferently, What shall I say your name, sir? Kemal Gürsoy. The gentleman's name is Kemal Gürsoy, my supervisor. The young man hung up the phone, murmuring something vaguely, and turned to Kemal Gürsoy and said, My commissioner is waiting for you, let me accompany you. Thank you, I know the way. 3 minutes later, Kemal Gürsoy was in Cemal Ezen's room. Cemal Ezen, the bald and pot-bellied commissioner, spoke with an exaggerated sincerity that was too extravagant to be true as he pointed to one of the armchairs in his large room for his former colleague to sit in. My dear friend, you really haven't changed at all. How long has it been since we've met? 5 years? 6. I'm afraid you've changed a bit. Your belly has grown bigger and your hair has shrunk a little more. Cemal Ezen sat down at his large desk and laughed, belly flopping. Haha. You haven't changed at all. Jokes aside, we were curious about you. Are you in good health? I'm fine, thanks. How are you? While Cemal Gürsoy was ordering 2 coffees with little sugar over the phone, he told his friend that he was in a good mood. You made me curious. Tell me, what's that not going to be talked about on the phone? Before starting to speak, Kemal Gürsoy entered the gallery section of his phone and found an image he had previously saved. Then he handed it to his friend. While Cemal Ezen was looking at the photo on the phone, Kemal Gürsoy started to explain his problem. Did your team take care of the young woman's body? Yes, I was there myself. A family who was hiking in the woods found it by accident. Have you been able to identify her? No. She's probably an orphan. Has an autopsy been done? Yes, a few days ago. There are no reports yet, but not for long. I'm starting to wonder where you are going to bring it up. I think I know who she is. For some reason, Cemal Ezen did not seem too surprised by his friend's statement. But his tone and facial expression were more serious than before. Go ahead, please. Kemal Gürsoy started the conversation from their mutual friend Ismail Çetin and told him what Mehmet Demirsoy, whom he had introduced, told him. It's really interesting. Does Mehmet Demirsoy know about the corpse? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Do you think he can identify the body? I think yes. Are you sure it's her? More or less. But she's not identified? Yes. For now it is so. What do you think, the other corpse? I don't think so. I didn't see anything about it. Hasn't your husband come home yet? You know, he said last week that he was going out for an emergency business lunch. To talk about the supposed malfunction on that ship. The next day, he said he had to go abroad to personally follow up on the incident. Are you sure you're lying? Of course. There are employees in the company who are closer to me than Mehmet. You're working today, aren't you? Yes, I'm in the hospital. Good. Come to my room around 4 o'clock. We'll talk about it in more detail. Also, I miss you. Me too. Elif Yilmaz and Semi Karakok hung up the phone at the same time. So you're still using this car? Aha. Welcome, my friend. I think this gentleman must be Mehmet Demirsoy. We found it pleasant, Simul. Mr. Mehmet, let me introduce you to Commissioner Simul Izin. The two men nodded and shook hands with Kemal Gursoy. Kemal told me what happened to you, Mr. Mehmet. I'm sorry for what you're going through. We will do our best to shed light on the incident. Please, I'm going to introduce you to our forensic expert. The trio, who walked about 50 meters under the leadership of Simul Izin, reached the entrance of the morgue hall and saw a man with messy hair in a white coat who looked like he was in his 50s. This time, it was Simul Izin's turn to undertake the introduction. Gentlemen, meet Dr. Ahmet Ergin. He personally took care of the autopsy process. He will give us a detailed explanation of the findings. Of course, after Mr. Mehmet identified the body. Hello doctor, how are you? My name is Mehmet Demirsoy. Hello. I was delighted. I'm fine. Greetings. I'm Kemal. We can't wait to hear what you find. I am pleased, Mr. Kemal. As the commissioner said, let's first move on to the morgue. Let's see if Mr. Mehmet confirms our prediction. After passing through two separate doors, the first leading to a narrow corridor and the other to the section with stairs leading below ground level, they finally reached the morgue by passing through a door on which it was written that only authorized personnel could enter. Dr. Ergin opened a round metal box and applied menthol cream to the lower part of his nose. Then he handed the box in his hand to Demirsoy in the sense of, "Do you want it?" and said, "I must warn you from the beginning, Mr. Mehmet, this may not be a very pleasant experience." Mehmet Demirsoy replied as he rejected the cream handed to him, saying, "Don't worry about me." Kemal Gursoy, who watched the short conversation of the two men, thought that Ahmet Ergin, whose face resembled a rodent, looked quite ridiculous with the white cream on his nose. Ahmet Ergin pulled open the mortuary chest made of metal material. He then unzipped the bag made of waterproof material that protected the body. The sight of the young woman in a hygienic body bag, designed to reduce the risk of contamination, was not pretty, as Dr. Ahmet Ergin said. Mr. Mehmet? Demirsoy stared at the body, which lay motionless for a few seconds, ignoring the fact that his stomach was lifted. If she were alive, I wonder what she would tell me. Mr. Mehmet, are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Is that her? Yes, it's Eileen Sargin. Are you sure? Absolutely. 10 minutes later, the four men were continuing their conversation in Dr. Ahmet Ergin's room, which was a little more sympathetic than the morgue room. I gave a copy of the autopsy reports to the commissioner before you came, said Ahmet Ergin, who was sitting at his desk, looking at Kemal Gursoy and Mehmet Demirsoy. You can look at it for a long time, but if you want, let me summarize the situation for you first. We would be delighted, said Kemal Gursoy, who was standing. Dr. Ahmet Ergin took the kettle in his hand, which was understood from the strange noises it made, and filled the cardboard cup on his desk with boiling water. The pleasant smell of black coffee, which had already been placed in the cup, spread throughout the room. After taking a sip of his coffee, Ergin continued. The young woman had marks on her wrists and ankles suggesting that she had been tied tightly with a sturdy rope to a chair or something similar before she was killed. She also had two separate syringe marks, both on her right arm. Considering that there was no bullet or sharp wound on her body, the syringe trace suggested that some kind of poison was used to kill the woman. There was no need to wait for the toxicology report or be a genius to make this extremely simple inference. The report would only reveal which chemical was used. What seemed surprising was why the woman had not one, but two separate syringe marks on her arm. Honestly, I couldn't answer that until the results were in. Kemal Gursoy interjected. Until you see the reports, of course. From what is written here, it is easy to understand why the woman was injected twice. Dr. Ahmet Ergin took over again. Exactly, Mr. Kemal. It is obvious that the second dose killed the poor woman. For this, strychnine is used. In the first dose, she was given sodium amytal. When Dr. Ahmet Ergin paused to take another sip of his coffee, which was starting to get colder, Kemal Gursoy intervened again. This shows that they tried to take words out of the woman's mouth before killing her. And why they tied her up is thus enlightened. Mehmet Demirsoy asked, "What is sodium amytal?" Ahmet Ergin answered the question. It's a chemical that has anesthetic and sedative effects. But apart from its medical use, it is also used in interrogations. It is assumed that the person whose statement is taken will not withhold information because of its comforting effect. I understand. What do you think they tried to learn from Eileen Sargin? Don't ask me that, Ahmet Ergin said. They must have wanted to know what she told you about what was going on, Kemal Gursoy said. At this point, two possibilities come to mind. They may have seen the two of you talking in the hospital and suspected something, or they may have read the email that Eileen Sargent sent you in some way. In this case, they know that I at least know something is wrong. Kamal Gursoy nodded in agreement. And what do you attribute to the fact that no one has ever reported a missing person? She probably doesn't have a family. She has, they will soon appear. We're going to look into that. It's horrible to believe that there was something big enough to kill a young woman. Mehmet Demirsoy, who was extremely tired, barely heard what he said. Then there was a silence in the room that lasted for a few seconds. It was Kamal Gursoy who broke the silence. I'm sorry for what you've been through, Mr. Mehmet. As we talked about before, Eileen Sargent was probably a part of this business like Elif Yilmaz and Semi Karakok, and for some reason they fell out later. And if you ask me, there's more than 3 people involved. So what happens now? Kamal Gursoy, who seemed tired of standing, took another look at the reports in his hand before replying to Mehmet Demirsoy. The crime scene examination had routine descriptions of where the body was found and under what circumstances. The victim's body was found buried in a local forest. The body was covered with a thin layer of soil, and the clothes on it were damp and partially decomposed. Although the corpse had been buried under the ground for 3 days, it had not yet entered a significant stage of decomposition due to the cool weather and soil structure. In the section where the explanations about the autopsy stage were included, there was nothing noteworthy other than the official language of what Dr. Ahmet Ergin briefly summarized in the external examination. The report ended with the cause of death, the manner of death, and the conclusion drawn from what happened. With the conclusion that the incident was a murder. Mr. Ahmed, it is not written in the report, but I couldn't help but ask, did you find any signs of sexual intercourse on the corpse? Nope. Kamal Gursoy turned to Mehmet Demirsoy and said, the mystery in this case is not about why and how Eileen Sargent was killed, but about what happened to your son and what happened in the background. We don't yet have the evidence to launch a formal investigation or arrest anyone. Therefore, I will try to gather information and reveal some things personally. In doing so, I will provoke others to give them a deficit. And my old friend Semel will excuse me up to a point. In return, I will tell him what I have learned, and when the time is right, I will step out from under his feet so that he can officially take over. I understand. You know best. By the way, there is a question that I neglected to ask you before, Mr. Mehmet. It can be critical at this very stage. As far as I remember, you told me that after the accident, Baris underwent a series of plastic surgeries due to burns on various parts of his body, and also underwent orthopedic treatment for some fractures and cracks. Has he had any other surgery or has he received any other treatment? It was clear from the facial expression that Mehmet Demirsoy did not expect such a question. After hesitating for a while, he said, not except for psychological support. But as I understand it, that's not what you mean. No, absolutely not. I ask you to reconsider my question. Can't there be something that you've overlooked or hidden from you? Frankly, I'm not sure, Mr. Kamal. Elif Yilmaz was in Semi Karakok's room 10 minutes after the phone call. Before they began to speak, they both looked at each other carefully. Is there any reason for us to be concerned about each other's facial expression, or body language? They seemed to be looking for the answer to this question. They knew each other well. No one was a child. Still, they did not neglect to pretend that these selfish glances were two lovers who loved and missed each other. In a way, this was true. There was something they missed about each other. Without breaking the silence, Semi Karakok passed by Elif and locked the door of his room. Then he put his hand in his pocket. He took out his phone and turned it off. Their lips met. 20 minutes later, when there was no longer a way to postpone what they had to talk about, Elif Yilmaz was the one who started the conversation. Do you think they will be able to identify Eileen? Semi Karakok lied by saying, it's hard. There was no point in talking about the man who had called him on the phone the day before and told him about Eileen Sargent. And also, even though they managed to make identification, we took precautions to secure ourselves. And do you think they'll find the other body? Semi Karakok was honest this time. I have no idea. Take a little more, old man, it will do you good. Mehmet Demirsoy did not object to the 2 extra stuffed peppers with olive oil, which Ali had put on his plate in a subordinate manner. The last thing he felt like was eating. But he knew that starving wouldn't solve anything. Mehmet Demirsoy was a guest at his brother Ali's house that evening at his intense insistence. There were 3 of them at the dining table in Ali Demirsoy's spacious kitchen. Nurkan, Ali and Mehmet Demirsoy. Ismail Chetin, who said he wanted to stop by if he had the opportunity, had not yet visited. While Nurkan Demirsoy was smoothing the fringe that had fallen on her forehead with her hand, She first looked at her husband who was trying to feed his brother, and then at Mehmet Demirsoy trying not to show it. The man looked really exhausted. In a matter of months he seemed to have aged 10 years. And he was pretty weak. But it still seemed to hold up well. But Nurkin had warned Ali at the time about the woman his brother was going to marry. She would feel that kind of thing right away. No one listened to her. If they had listened, they wouldn't have been in these situations. After smoothing the fringe that had fallen back on her forehead once more, she picked up some more salad on her plate. Mehmet Demirsoy thanked his brother. "Don't worry, I'm eating. The food was great as always." "Thanks, Nurkin." "Bon appetit, Mehmet, is that okay?" Mehmet Demirsoy looked at his watch as he reluctantly gagged. "Really, where is Ismail? Do you think he skipped us?" "Don't worry, he's probably stuck in traffic as usual," Ali Demirsoy said. "Tell us about this man you hired until Ismail arrives," Nurkin Demirsoy said timidly. Then she straightened her fringe and continued. "Is he trustworthy?" "I don't know him that well yet, but Ismail told me that he was a very resourceful person when he served as a police officer. Frankly, it encouraged me. Yesterday when we went to the forensic center." "Is it when he worked as a police officer?" "What does he work as now?" interjected. At the same time, someone knocked the door as if to save Mehmet Demirsoy from the statements he did not want to make. Ali Demirsoy jumped up to open it. Ismail Chetin had arrived. The conversation in Ali Demirsoy's house continued in the living room of the house. Ismail Chetin grimaced and said, "Poor woman. So they use strychnine. What can I say, one should choose one's friends carefully." "True. Now what?" "According to Mr. Kemal, the best thing to do is to gather as much information as possible before resorting to official means. From what I understand, he thinks there's more to it than meets the eye." "He's right. Taking action without understanding the facts of the matter and gathering concrete evidence could result in ruining a sack of figs." Mehmet Demirsoy was about to reply to his friend that he agreed with him, when he noticed the notification sound on his phone. "Hello, Mr. Mehmet. I am İPUCU Sahin. I need to talk to you face to face as soon as possible. What I have to say is important. Forgive me for rejecting you earlier." Ismail Chetin and Ali Demirsoy, who had carried the binge chapter from the kitchen to the living room, noticed that Mehmet Demirsoy's face turned pale and said at the same time, "Is there a problem?" Nurkin Demirsoy, who was hypnotized by the local series she watched, did not notice anything. İPUCU Sahin wrote a message. "This is the nurse who is Elif's friend from school. She wants to talk to me. Are you going to speak?" "Of course I'll." Kemal Gursoy sat in front of his computer. He knew what it was that he was looking for. But he wasn't quite sure what words to use to express it. With some hesitation in the search engine, he typed, "face transplantation." He clicked on the first of the results. He had just begun to read when he heard a knock on his door. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. He walked briskly towards the door. This time he didn't say "Who are you" before opening it, because he guessed who it was. When he opened the door, he saw that the young woman who had visited him the previous week had arrived. This time she isn't alone. The friend he had mentioned on her first visit had come with her. Kemal Gursoy looked at the young woman, smiled and said, "Please pass, I was waiting for you." Then, turning to the other visitor, he said, "I think you must be him. Your friend talked about you a lot on her first visit. I couldn't wait to meet you," he said as he gestured in. Mehmet Demirsoy was stunned to see İPUCU Sahin in a wheelchair. Until a few months ago, she was an extremely beautiful and healthy young woman. But now, initially he even suspected it was a bad joke, but apparently it was all very real. Mehmet Demirsoy experienced the second shock when İPUCU Sahin stated that Elif Yilmaz was probably responsible for her situation. What is the maximum a person can be bad? And why? Will I see more of that? The day after Mehmet Demirsoy spent the night at his brother's house, he met with İPUCU and Barak Sahin at the cafe called Luca Style in Ortaköy Square in the afternoon. Their conversation took place at a table overlooking the sea. Demirsoy stared absent-mindedly at the magnificent view. The Bosphorus Bridge was magnificent even for someone who had spent his entire life in Istanbul. It was still light, but with the lighting of the bridge in the evening, the view would become even more fascinating. The scenery was completed by the boats gliding over the waters of the Bosphorus and the dance of the seagulls. The coastline of the Anatolian side could also be seen from where Demirsoy was sitting. The businessman thought that there are billions of people who would not see such a sight even once in their lifetime, which is an ordinary part of his life. Immediately afterwards, he realized that all these beauties were not enough to alleviate the pain he was experiencing. Trying to shake off his thoughts, he turned to İPUCU Sahin. "Are you not planning to file a criminal complaint?" he asked. Since you are sure that what happened to you was sabotage? Barak Sahin answered the question asked to İPUCU Sahin. We discussed this with our lawyer. He doesn't think there's any way to prove our allegations. Of course, if it turns out that Elif is responsible for what happened to me and my son, then things could change, Demirsoy said. There was a short silence. The silence was broken by İPUCU Sahin. I hope you're not accusing us of selfishness. If you felt that way, if I hadn't tried to help you from the beginning, maybe I'd be right now. İPUCU Sahin could not complete her sentence. You misunderstood me. Please rest assured. On the contrary, I owe you a debt of gratitude. I'd love to hear anything you want to tell me. İPUCU Sahin recovered quickly. She told Mehmet Demirsoy what she had witnessed about Elif's student years, as she had told her husband before. Then she brought the word to Elif's son. Kemal Gürsoy had a long conversation with the young woman he hosted and the other visitor. He then promised both of them to keep them updated on the developments. After bidding farewell to his guests, he returned to his computer and continued his unfinished research. An hour later, it entered the e-government system. From there, he requested a doctor's appointment for himself. He felt lucky when the system gave him an appointment for the very next day. He might as well have had to wait weeks.